Chapter 1, The World Before 1492. Chapter 1, Section 1, The Peopling of North America. About 36,000 years ago, dry land existed between Siberia and North America, creating a land bridge connecting the Asian and North American continents. Hunters were believed to have followed food migrations from Siberia across the land bridge into North America. Further migration by boat continued down the coast of North America to reach South America. New evidence over the years, though, has shown that theories can change. While historians used to believe that migration took place over foot across the land bridge, new theories tell us that migration by boat was probably more realistic. There are even some monuments in Africa that have similar masonry to monuments in South America, leading historians to believe that people potentially sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, west across the Atlantic Ocean, to reach the Americas. All of this new evidence tells us that while we initially thought the Clovis were the first settled people in North America living in what's now the southwestern United States, that's potentially no longer true with these new discoveries. Next, the text talks about the Anasazi, who were living in the American Southwest 700 years before Columbus arrived in the late 1400s. They settled mostly in Arizona and New Mexico. The Anasazi were urbanized, they cultivated crops, and built roads for trade. Chaco Canyon was the center of trade and religion for the Anasazi. Climate change in the early 1100s to 1300s forced migration and the abandonment of settlements. The Cahokia were a mound-building tribe located in the Mississippi River Valley. Pictured on the left, you see the mounds that were built as burials for prominent figures in the community, historians believe. On the right, we see walled cities with thatched covered houses. The Cahokia flourished between 900 and 1300 in the Mississippi River Valley. The women were responsible for farming while the men hunted. Large communities and large population could be supported by their agricultural achievements. Historians also believe that religious ceremonies were performed atop the central mounds in each Cahokia town. Section 1.2 is about the Pueblo people of the Southwest. The Pueblo people of the Southwest built large settlements with canals, dams, and terracing to allow agriculture to flourish in an arid climate. Their staple crops were corn, beans, and squash. The Pueblo people domesticated turkey and used dogs to hunt wild game. The Pueblo people spoke different languages, but were connected by trade and common religious practices. Pictured on this slide are the settlements that range from the east bank of the Mississippi to the Piedmont of the Appalachian Mountains. That's the area we would discuss when talking about the Mississippi River Valley. There was a climate shift in this valley starting in the 1300s known as the Little Ice Age. It lasted till about 1800. The climate shift reduced the food supply and turned big settlements into smaller communities. Those smaller communities became warring tribes and forced communities to build wooden walls for protection. Tribes in present-day South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee all flourished during this time period. Native peoples of the Pacific Coast, especially the Pacific Northwest, lived on seafood and fish such as salmon. California was so rich in natural resources that native peoples could live on hunting and gathering wild food. Because of the excess resources, there was no need for farming. The Iroquois Confederacy, located in the Northeast and Great Lakes region, was made up of 5 tribes of the Iroquois. Those 5 are the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, and they joined together to form a united front against enemies and later Europeans arriving to the Northeast. Iroquois clans were led by women who chose men to serve on councils, which became an early model of self-government. Benjamin Franklin, who's pictured on the right, would even use their model for his Albany Plan of Union in 1754. Native peoples in North America built extensive trade networks, yet each tribe was the center of its own world and thought of themselves separately, which prevented them from creating a unified defense against Europeans when the Europeans began arriving in the Americas. Tribes would trade with or partner with Europeans if it benefited their tribe. They used the saying, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." Types of war were different between Native Americans and Europeans. Native Americans often fought to bring balance to their world, while Europeans fought for total conquest. A changing Europe in the 1400s. In the 1400s, the Catholic Church controlled life and learning. Since most people living in Europe at the time were poor and illiterate, they were stuck in their socioeconomic class for life. The spread of the bubonic plague took the European population from 70 million people to about 45 million people through illness and through persecution. Groups who were persecuted during the time of the plague were Jews, religious nonconformists, and foreigners. This set up an inherent bias against people who were different. We'll see Europeans bring that bias with them when they travel to the Americas. In 1453, the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople in present-day Turkey, eventually renaming the city Istanbul and ruling for the next 4 centuries. This was devastating to Christians. Constantinople had been the center of Mediterranean trade and the connection for Europe to Eastern markets. Remember, Constantinople or Istanbul connected 3 continents: Europe, Africa, and Asia. Muslim Ottoman Turks cut off trade routes to Christians. This forced Christians to find new trade routes with the East. Okay. The rise of Portuguese exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator, who's pictured on the left, started a school for sailors to help develop these new trade routes and connections that had been cut off by the Ottoman Turks. On the right, we see a picture of a caravel, which was a small, highly maneuverable ship that the Portuguese developed. They also developed better instruments and maps to lead Portuguese exploration. In 1444, the Portuguese were able to reach Senegal and began trading slaves. 1460, they claimed the Cape Verde Islands. 1488, Bartolome Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope. And in 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India following Diaz's route. The Portuguese developed trading colonies and the slave trade with Africa because Africa was rich in natural resources like gold. England and France. England and France fought in a series of wars known as the Hundred Years' War from 1337 to 1453. England wanted control of France as England was ruled by Norman lineage. After the Hundred Years' War had ended, France launched into their own civil war until 1477, while the English did the same, their civil war being called the War of Roses, until 1485. Fighting in these wars, the Hundred Years' War, and their respective civil wars, diverted funds and time that Portugal had been spending on exploration. This left England and France behind. The unification and rise of Spain. On the left, we see Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castilla, who married in 1469 and finished the Reconquista by conquering the remaining 3 Muslim kingdoms by 1492, which unified Spain under the Catholic religion and Catholic monarchs. Spain benefited from Muslim scholars who reintroduced information during the Dark Ages and ironically reintroduced Europeans to earlier classical European works. The Spanish wanted alternative routes for Eastern sea trade because they could not use the routes that Portugal had developed. So that's when they commissioned Christopher Columbus, who sailed west. Section 1.4, Africa in the 1400s, the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Africa and Europe had been linked through Mediterranean trade for 3,000 years. Ghana's power was based on controlling the gold trade and metalwork. Gold and salt were the primary trade products on the trans-Saharan trade. In 1050, Mali expanded and replaced Ghana. 1324, Mansa Musa made a famous pilgrimage to Mecca, where he brought so much gold that he single-handedly devalued the world's currency. This let the world know how rich in natural resources the African continent was. Songhai was east of Mali and grew powerful under rulers like Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad. They also used trade to grow wealthy. Congo, Benin, and Central Africa were south of Mali and far less powerful. In the 1490s, the Portuguese converted the King of Congo to Catholicism. Europeans tried to meddle in elections and support powerless kings in West Africa. Kings relied on Portugal for help, and in return, Portugal exploited those kings and kingdoms using the slave trade. Slavery was important long before the Portuguese arrived in Africa. Portugal shifted the slave trade from overland trade, or the trans-Saharan trade, to an overseas trade, as the map shows. Portugal also added a subhuman element of slavery by stripping people of their culture and surroundings. Section 1.5 focuses on Asia in the 1400s. In the 1420s, Asia was far ahead of Europe in terms of technology. Asia was using gunpowder versus European bows and arrows, as well as building much larger ships called treasure fleets. At the time, Beijing was also 50 times larger than the city of London. By the 1490s, China had depleted forests, and government officials resented sea captains or admirals, and began a 200-year period of isolation. In the 1490s, India became engaged in trade with Europe.